How many of you are aware of the illegal incarceration of nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast during World War II? Helen Hannan Parra. She's here to share her story with you, and she will be interviewed by Cathy Crosthwaite, herself a longtime Placer County resident. Now, take a second and really think about this question. We want you to think about what would you have done if you had 2 days and only one suitcase to bring with you before you were shipped off to prison. You would have to get rid of all your possessions, including your beloved pets, your cars, your phones, in 2 days. And on top of that, you have no idea where you're going. What would you bring with you?
After Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States was gripped by fear, anger, and racial prejudice. In the name of national security, 120,000 Japanese Americans, innocent men, women, and children, citizens and non-citizens alike, were soon incarcerated in American concentration camps. Not a single one was ever found guilty of espionage or sabotage. And I think that that's really important to know. Language is really important, and for our history, we have termed that period of time as the internment, or Japanese internment camps. And really what they were concentration camps where innocent people were detained and imprisoned. Very, I want to say entertaining, in that it's very easy to get through, but of course the story is not one that we ever want to repeat. Did you want to add to what Stu said about what the students should think about during your talk about packing up that one suitcase?
Yes, I was thinking that, as we were saying, this is what you would have had to pack. You had to think about your room at home, all the stuff you have, and imagine if you had to go in there right now and pick up one suitcase and decide what you are going to fill that suitcase with. And it's going to be just basic necessities. It's not going to be any fun things. And what was really sad was you could not take your pets. You simply had to abandon your dog and cat, and they would never know what they had done to be abandoned. But you could have explained to them. You hoped the neighbors would feed them, but you didn't really know.
Your dad was in the military as a lawyer, right? Oh no, he trained.
Yeah, he was training troops to go over to Europe, but the war in Europe ended just then, so they did not need any more troops trained for Europe.
Right, so this was in 1945.
Yes.
And people had been incarcerated since 1942. But in 1945, you and your family, you had two siblings and a mom and a dad, and you had already been relocated 4 different times during the war, and you were in Florida.
Yes.
And what made your father go, hey family, what a great thing, let's go to a concentration camp?
Well, you have to know who my father was. He was an amazing person. He was a lawyer, and a very good one. He worked for a fine law firm in Chicago, where they were holding his job. He could go back whenever he could. Well, not only was he a fine lawyer, but he was a fine human being. The general who was in charge of the base there in Florida hated Jews. He just hated them for no reason. Even as a little child, I used to think, does he know that part of the reason we're fighting this war is because of what Hitler is doing to the Jews? A friend who said, what are you going to do now that you're leaving us? Everybody on the base knew about this war going on between Dad and the general. So he just asked me, he said, what are you going to do? And Dad said, don't worry about me. I've got a job to go back to. I've got a house to go back to. We'll be fine. We'll just go home. And the man's answer was, I'm sorry to hear that. And Dad said, why are you sorry to hear that? And he said, because the government is looking for lawyers for WRA, and you would be perfect. And Dad said, what's WRA? We had never heard of any of this. The government kept this as quiet as they could. Once they had done it, they realized what a horrible thing they had done. And they weren't exactly going around shouting from the rooftops about it.
So what was the WRA?
Pardon me?
What was the WRA?
WRA was War Relocation Authority. It was the branch of the government that was running the Japanese concentration camps.
To go to Camp Amache in Colorado.
Yes, exactly. We were on our way from Florida to Amache, which was outside of Granada, Colorado, in southeastern Florida. And evidently, God took a fine hand in here. I think he really wanted Dad to get to Amache because we were driving through the swamp in Louisiana in the middle of the night on a Saturday night. And can you believe, we were pulling a trailer that had all of our stuff in it, and it was being pulled behind a Packard car. You don't know Packard cars. They were very powerful. And we had a little trailer that was being pulled that actually had wooden wheels. During the war, you used what you could get hold of. Well, anyway, going through the swamp, the little trailer suddenly decided that it was going to quit its job. It completely collapsed.
You're thinking you're going to a camp. And
Yes, my idea of camp was summer camp. They never should have called these places camps. You've been to summer camp. It's fun. These were, prison. They were prisons, period. You couldn't really, and they were horrible. They did not.
What were your first impressions when you drove in?
All around were guard towers with soldiers with guns pointing down all around. I mean, even on our side, we were on the side where the employees lived, but we were being watched by guards with guns also. And it was scary. I mean, I'm an Army brat. I was used to being on bases where people carried guns, but this was not like anything I had experienced. And it was scary. And as somebody once asked me, she didn't think, I'm sure, she said, how is it different for the people on your side as opposed to the people, the prisoners? And I said, well, the main difference was if I walked out the gate, no one would shoot me. If they walked out the gate, they would be shot.
As I remember, you were pretty put off by that question
Yes, I
when
was.
it was posed.
I thought, what a stupid question. You must know that, they were the prisoners. It's like asking a guard in a prison, how is it different for you than the guy in the cell? I mean, you ought to be able to figure that out for yourself. Well, anyway, Dad just fell in love with these people. He said they were the most wonderful people. He had never known a Japanese person in his entire life. And he was so impressed with the way they were coping. All their family was there. I mean, Grandma was there, Baby was there, and everybody in between. Most men, when they go to prison, they don't have to take Grandma and little Baby and everybody else with them. They're there by themselves. And the living conditions were horrible. Room, 20 by 20 feet. And each one of you has one army cot. And there is no other furniture in the room except one light bulb hanging from the ceiling. And that light bulb dominated life because all 8 of you had to agree on when that light bulb was on or off. Think about it. We live in houses with many rooms and many light bulbs. Everybody had to agree. Mother would put the baby down, but the baby couldn't go to sleep because the light was on. Grandma would love to go to sleep, but Grandma couldn't go to sleep. But then the teenage kids were all trying to get their homework done. They did have a school. They did that much. But the kids were all having to get their homework done. And maybe Dad was trying to do something. And so anyway, finally, you know, at 10:30 or 11, they would decide to turn off the light and everyone would go to sleep. But then the kids had to get up at first light of dawn in the morning to finish their homework at the one window where the light was filtering in as dawn was breaking. And meanwhile, you have this one light bulb. Think about that when you go home tonight. There is one light bulb in this house. Who is going to turn it on and off and when? The soldiers had searchlights on at night, so probably so they were watching you as you ran along. But anyway, it was just completely, they did not consider that these people were human beings. They were simply something, they had to store them, and they had to keep them alive, or they would be in trouble. Not that they were worried about them, but they would be in trouble. They had to keep these people alive, you know, however they did it. And they, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just shifting.
The food was horrible. These people were used to eating good food because some of them were farmers, some were not, but mostly the Asian people back then, before McDonald's, were eating better than Caucasian people just because they had better sense.
I was going to interject real quick. So here's a really uncomfortable thing to envision. So you're, you know, a teen and you are eating the wrong food and things are not settling well. And you are running to the bathroom and there you are next to grandma. There is no barrier, there's no anything. And you are taking care of what you need to take care of. And that was their reality. So I want to change a little bit here. So that is how those conditions, you got to know about them personally because you were friends with, you chose to be friends with the other Japanese children as opposed to the other staff children. Hanamachi, you were setting up your barrack home, and then you needed to go into town and get a bank account and buy some groceries and just kind of settle in. How was that experience going into the neighboring town when you first got there?
It was terrible. The little towns outside of the camps hated the Japanese Americans who were the prisoners, but they hated us too because they saw it that we were taking care of them and babying them and coddling them, which was so far from the truth. But they saw it this way, and they were so negative, they wouldn't sell us things. They wouldn't open a bank account for my poor dear father, the saint who had gotten us all there, went into town to open a bank account. And they said, we don't do business with people in the camp. My father was living in Colorado and his bank was in Florida. And this was before anything electronic. If you wanted to ask your banker a question, you wrote him a letter and mailed it. And in 2 weeks you had an answer. And that was how my poor father was functioning. Sell us, they didn't put the magazines out. And he said, we don't have any. Well, while I was milling around looking at something else, a woman who was of the town, a local, came in, and he immediately reached under the counter and sneaked a magazine out and gave it to her. And I saw, and I was not happy.
So yeah, prejudice was alive and well throughout this area, not even just the camps.
They hated us because they thought that we were, if they had any idea how these poor people were living, they say, no privacy in the bathroom. You're sitting with 200 other people trying to take care of business, and no curtain, no door, no nothing. And they acted like they were animals. They did not realize that they were people. So the government was horrible to them.
What did you do? What was a normal day like for you at camp?
Well, we, of course, we had a house, not a house, we had an apartment with several rooms, and we had a bathroom and a kitchen even. We were really lucky, but we would get up in the morning, we went to the mess hall to eat. There was a mess hall for the staff and a mess hall for the prisoners, because it was very hard to get food, as we were saying. They didn't want to sell us anything. So we mostly were eating in a mess hall also. And then there was really nothing, well, we kids went to school, but there was really nothing for my mother to do very much. She sewed a lot and things like that. But what was the problem was the poor prisoners, their day, they had nothing to do. They had to leave everything behind. The kids had to leave all their toys. The teenagers had to leave, you know, your music, your sports equipment, you know, whatever, you know, the stuff you occupy yourself with. Think of what you do when you go home. When you went home after school, you couldn't even get cookies and milk because you had no food in your house. You had to wait till dinner and then go to the mess hall. And I mean, there was nothing for you to do. And nobody had been able to bring any kind of hobby stuff. So what they did was they began creating a small town life for themselves. Anybody who knew how to do anything taught a class in it, or they organized a club for it. And they simply, and for the kids, if you knew how to do this, you would teach everybody's children to do this. And they formally did this because they knew this was the only childhood their children were going to have. And they had to do the very best they could. They couldn't just sit there and sulk. Imagine, you're raising your kids in a prison, and you've got to do the very best, because in 4 years they will be out again, and they will be competing with Caucasian kids who were not in prison. They will be trying to get into college. They will be trying to get good jobs, competing with kids who have not gone through this traumatic experience. So they had to create the best possible childhood they could for their kids in the prison camp, and they did.
Is that this, the people that were in this prison, as you said, they were doing everything possible to create a normal life for their families.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the creativity that came out of this and what they used?
These places were ugly as sin, and they scrounged around and found whatever little bit of beauty that they could. They painted, they carved wood, they went down to, at Tule Lake, they went down to the old, it had been a lake, obviously. They dug up the old shells that were down 4 and 6 feet deep and made beautiful jewelry out of them. These women were just so artistic, and they were simply trying to create a little bit of beauty. Whoever could paint, painted. The men carved. I have 2 adorable little wooden birds that an old man made. He carved them and painted them, and they're beautiful. And all he could do was scotch tape a pin onto the back of it. Yes. I'm 91 and I sometimes forget my train of thought.
Atomic bombs were dropped in August. Atomic bombs. They were dropped in August of 1945.
Yes.
So you were still at Camp Amachi, and how did everyone react to that?
Well, it was very sad because a lot of people there had lost people, you know, when Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed, a lot of people had lost people there, and so shortly thereafter, just within days, the war was over, Japan surrendered, but we did not celebrate because we knew too many people were hurting, and there was not a sound in the camp. When the war in Europe had ended, we were living in a town, and then of course the town went wild. But this time there was no anything. We all were just glad that it was over, and nobody celebrated.
The Camp Amachi closed, And you thought you were to be heading back to Chicago, right?
Yes.
But your dad had something else in mind.
Yes, we thought, okay, now we go back to Chicago, where Dad has his job and we have our house and Mother has her gardens. My mother even had a little orchard, and she was, would have been happy to go back. But Dad said, I haven't really been able to do much, and I came here to help. And Tule Lake, which is up on the Oregon border up here, you probably know. It's just a couple miles from Oregon. Anyway, that was where they had put all the people they considered to be bad apples, so to speak. It was called the Segregation Center. And so Dad said, I want to go up there because those people are really in trouble and I can help them. So instead of going home, my dear father went to Tule Lake, and he was able to do a lot of good there. In fact, when people were being sent back to Japan at the end, young kids were being sent back who were American citizens, but their family were putting pressure on them to go back. My father was the only one who insisted that every one of these kids be fingerprinted so that when all this madness was over, they could come back to America. Nobody else thought of this but my dear father. I think he probably did it himself. Hundreds of teenagers and young kids got fingerprinted so that they could prove they were American citizens and come home. And that was probably one of the biggest things he did. Although he also was helping them to prepare for hearings. They had been pressured into giving up their citizenship of all the stupid things. The government pushed them. The government, I think, was hoping they would break, and they weren't breaking. So the government was lying awake nights thinking of what else can we do. And so they said, we're going to tell them that they can all renounce their citizenship. And before that, they had to take a loyalty oath, that all their loyalty was only to America. Well, a lot of these old people were Japanese citizens. They could not become American citizens. If they renounced their Japanese citizenship, they would be stateless. And you people know, you've studied, everybody has to belong to some country. You can't be stateless. You have to be the citizen of some place. And if you can't become an American citizen, you've got to keep your Japanese citizenship, or you don't have anything. So they did. We were already living in a prison with guards and guns and barbed wire and the whole thing. But that wasn't enough. They built a prison building inside this prison, and they put a whole bunch of people in there. And they actually boarded up the windows so they could not look out and see their families who would be outside waving to them, to cheer them on and everything. They couldn't even see their families.
So this camp at Tule Lake had a very different feel than Camp Amachi, right?
Yes, Camp Amachi was a summer camp compared to this. There were tanks driving around. It was under martial law, if you know what that means. That the army was like the government, and the army could do it. The general in charge was like the governor or whatever, and so he could do anything he wanted and did. And there were tanks driving around inside this place, if you can imagine such a thing. And it was horrible, and there was just an oppressive air. And you didn't know if maybe you would make a misstep and get shot or something. The air in Tule Lake was horrible. It was a miserable place to be.
How did you interact with those friends? Tell us about that. I mean, you were a 12-year-old kid.
Yes, well, I had a little friend named Tony, and I could go over to the prison side and literally sign Tony out to come to our quarters on the staff side. I would have to go through a guard with a gun, and he would sign, I would have to sign her out. And she was my age. She was probably smarter than I was, but I was in charge. Little pipsqueak me was doing all of this, and she would just have to stand there like I was checking out a library book was the way I felt I was doing it. And the guard would growl, you have to have her back at 3 o'clock. And I thought, if I don't have her back at 3 o'clock, are you going to fine me? It was just like checking out a library book. You had to sign her out and have her back by a certain time. And she just stood there as if she was an inanimate object.
And you were there during the, or your family was there during the entire time. So your dad's role there really was to help those that signed, that filled out that loyalty oath questionnaire to the point where they gave up their citizenship but didn't realize they were doing it. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this questionnaire, it caused all kinds of consternation and split families. It basically was asking people, are you going to be loyal to the United States, or are you going to give up your citizenship to Japan? And of course, half these people had never been to Japan.
Yes.
And then they were being asked, will they be loyal to the country who has imprisoned them? So it was definitely a conversation that was being had, and it was not easy, and many people, as you said, had given up their US citizenship, not really realizing what they were doing. After the war has ended.
Yes, the war was over, and they were all still in prison because of this loyalty oath thing. And the government had deliberately done this. The government was simply trying to make more trouble for them. And some of these families had young men in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Have you ever heard of that? It was an outfit made up totally of Japanese American soldiers.
They were fighting in Italy, right?
And these people were fighting for the country that was imprisoning their grandmother. And they were loyal citizens. They were the most decorated outfit in World War II in the American Army because they were so determined to show their loyalty. I mean, they were just taking every risk in the world because they were trying to show their loyalty to the country that had ruined their lives.
And now that the war was ended, and they signed this loyalty oath that was not clear, and your father was there really fighting for them, so they didn't lose literally everything that they had already lost. But in the meantime, as the camp is closing, you're witnessing some families having to ship back to Japan, and others going back to where they hope is home.
Yes, it was an emotional time because, as Cathy said, some of them were truly trying to go home, if home might still be there. Others were going to Japan more or less against their will. There were some poor old people who were going to Japan because they wanted to go to Japan, because the poor dears thought Japan had won the war, because we had no news in camp. They didn't know Japan had lost the war. It wasn't until their ship sailed into Yokohama Bay and people came out in little boats begging for food. And they thought, what in the world have we done, you know? But it was too late then.
We only have a few more minutes, and I did want to touch on this. So this all happened 80 years ago.
Yes.
And you wrote this book.
Yes.
Why this book now? And I know that your family has been working on this and compiling the story and the pictures, but why does it resonate so much now for you?
Because, as I say, actually I started writing this book when I was in camp. I would get under my bed with pencil and paper and write out everything that I was angry about that was happening. And then, of course, I got married, had a family, was busy, and 75 years later I got it out again, and as an 83-year-old grandmother I published it. But, as I say, I was busy in between, and well, now the thing is, this could happen again. You people sitting here enjoying your teenage years, in 30 years, you are going to be running everything, and you want to get it right. You don't want to do what the generations ahead of you did. This must never happen again. So please pay attention. You think right now, oh, I'm not going to be doing this or that, but some of you may really have positions of importance. And my father used to always say, the higher position of authority you have, the more people you can hurt if you do it wrong.
And there's always been times throughout our history, I mean, since this time,
Yes.
where there have been discussions about doing something similar.
You don't remember, you weren't born yet, but you've heard of 911 when they blew up the Twin Towers. Anyway, right after, you know that?
Yeah.
Right after that, they began to, people muttering, do I see it someone's arm up? No, I guess not, okay. Anyway, let me finish this thought. They began to think of, let's lock up everybody in prison that's wearing a turban. Well, the people who blew up the Twin Towers were not wearing turbans. Everybody was dark skin. Well, you don't choose the color skin you're going to have. I mean, we all look the way we look. The fact that you look like a bad person does not mean you are a bad person. And all of this, because I remember this clearly, it was just about 25 years ago, and everything was simply, oh, you lock up everybody with dark skin, lock up everybody. Poor little old men going out for their afternoon walks wearing a turban would get shot. In this part, in Northern California, people got shot just out for their afternoon walk because some idiot associated them with the Twin Towers.
Alice is in the front row,
Yeah.
and she was in camp. Which camp
Yes,
was she in?
we were girls together in the camp. She would come over to our quarters with her little sisters because they had nothing to do with on their side, and we had board games, and we had potatoes that you could make into French fries, which was a huge thing. You can't think of that, but French fries were huge. And we would make French fries and play board games. There may be a picture out there of her sitting on the floor with her little sister, and way over in the corner I'm sitting on the chair. But anyway, my darling father financed a month for her in school with me when I went to boarding school, because their school was closing, and he said, Alice is too smart to be left sitting around doing nothing. And he actually paid a month for her to go to boarding school with me so she could keep up on her work. And anyway, we did not see each other for 80 years. And now, all of a sudden, we are reunited, and we've taken up right where we left off. Imagine if, 80 years from now, you run into one of your classmates, and you just take right up where you left off, like you've never been apart.
I wanted to thank you so much for being here.
People to know what happened so that your generation will do better than the generations before you, and this will never happen again, because you're going to know what happened and you're going to get it right.
Alice is Mike Takayama's mom and Mike Takayama Jim Floor. That was the connection we were hoping to make there for you. And so we wanted to thank you guys. You were a great audience. Thank you for being here and listening, and hope you've learned something today.